Hello to everyone, and sorry for not being able to be present physically at the webinar. I will start my intervention with a short citation. So I got this citation from Roy Jacobson, and I think it's perfectly perfect for the kind of talk I want to give. So let me get going. So what is forecasting? It's basically the art of looking backward to predict the future. And basically what we try to find is episodes whose pattern resemble the current one and take advantage of historical insight to be able to predict or attach probability to future possibilities. Now, obviously, everybody knows that when the past is different from the future, for example, there are structural break or regime switches, that cannot be done. And then also it cannot be done when there are no episodes like the current one in the past. Clearly, the current pandemic belongs to the second category. There is nothing like what we have seen in the second quarter 2020, unless you go back basically to the Spanish flu of 1918. And unfortunately, we don't have detailed enough data on the Spanish flu to be able to predict how the economy will be today. Obviously, some people have tried to use the data to learn something about it. There are two working papers from the NBR, which are in the slides here. But it's hard to use the episode, for example, to predict how the recovery from the pandemic will look like. And one of the big problems nowadays is essentially that the uncertainty has increased exponentially. And just to give you a ballpark estimate, for the second quarter to 2020, the professional forecast projection range was basically minus 0.8, minus 0.64 on an annual basis. And these wild differences are obviously due to the fact that there are a lot of policy changes. The economic data are not very reliable, in particular survey data nowadays are not going to be helpful to predict where the economy is going to look like. And obviously, economic forecasts have to delve into the unfamiliar world of epidemiology to be able to merge the current situation with the standard modeling. So what can we do? Well, I see only two possibilities. The first one is to use scenario analysis. So take standard macroeconometric model and then try to design a scenario that looks like COVID. The question is how? And that's not a small question. First of all, what is a COVID? What equation or margin are affected? How do we calibrate the size, the persistence, the correlation of this shock with others? And there are some questions which obviously require a little bit more than the standard macroeconometric model. For example, people want to know what's the difference between an aggressive shutdown versus a mild shutdown plus some form of medical treatment. And obviously to do this, we need to have some part which talk about shutdown and a part that talk about medical treatment. And I think the most important issue is how to robustify the inference. Here, what do? We take average over different size, persistence. We take the worst possible outcome. Well, it's really hard to say. So there has been some progress. There's a working team at the Fed of Chicago, which has put out some preliminary work, which I cited here. And basically what they do, they kind of discipline the analysis by designing a synthetic shock, which loads on a number of margins. So it can be interpreted as a mix of supply and demand shock, which has anticipated medium-term effect. And to calibrate the size and the persistence, they use a narrative approach. Basically, the shock should explain almost all the fall in 2020 quarter two, and produce inflation and output expectation, which are consistent with the survey of professional forecast over the next 4 quarters. So what they do, they predict, they produce pictures that look like this one. For example, this is output growth, in which, as you can see, the COVID shocks, which is the red one, explain most of the stuff. And then, as you can see, there's going to be some kind of rebounding and then convergence back to zero, and the COVID shock is still going to be important on the transition path. Similarly, there's another picture that they present on inflation, in which you can see here the COVID shock is giving some positive effect of inflation, but overall the inflation is going to be pretty weak, and for most of the next few years it's probably going to be negative. The second approach is obviously to collect high-frequency data, with these high-frequency data to construct real-time indicators, and then link them to macro models or macro variables with mixed frequency or nowcasting. Now, there is now an industry of this. For example, the Fed of New York and the Fed of Chicago are producing this weekly economic index, which is based on daily data on labor market production consumption behavior. The Chicago Fed has a daily indicator based on very unusual things like restaurant reservation, supermarket expenditure, and GPS movement. And this is a latest picture produced for the weekly economic index. So the index is the blue line. As you can see, it predicts the fall. It predicts it with an anticipation with respect to output. And if you look at the 13 weeks moving average, which is the red line, which is truncated, seems to follow pretty well the path of output, at least in the US. So what else do we have? Not much, really. One can look at disaggregated and sectorial information. I'm not sure really what these things will bring. And for the rest, I'm not really sure. So my punchline are very simple. I don't think there are many alternatives to traditional approaches, which involve macroeconometric models or time series models. The uncertainty is very large, and probably when uncertainty will go back to the standard, we'll return at business as usual in terms of forecasting. And meanwhile, the only option that we have available is to do exercise with a lot of care. So thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.